At the Berlin Conference, it was agreed that Russia should have rump Bulgaria for a transitional period of 9 months before handing it over to an elected ruler who would then govern it within the Turkish Empire. In April 1879, when Prince Alexander of Battenberg, the nephew of the Tsar, was elected Prince of Bulgaria, the Russians hoped at first that they would effectively be able to dominate the new government behind the scenes. However, tension rapidly began to develop between Alexander and his Russian advisors. In September 1883, he asserted his own independence by expelling two key Russian officials. The Russians were now determined to get rid of Alexander, but in September 1885 his position appeared to be strengthened when a revolt broke out in eastern Rumelia, which resulted in its unification with Bulgaria. The Russians accepted a compromise put forward by the British, whereby the two states would remain technically separated but under the same ruler. They were not, however, ready to tolerate Alexander as that ruler. In August 1886 the Russians had kidnapped and forced him to abdicate. Even then the Bulgarian parliament stubbornly refused to accept the Russian candidate as its ruler and voted instead in July 1887 for Prince Frederick of Coburg, who was born in Vienna and had served in the Austrian army. Alexander's kidnapping revived British and Austrian fears of Russia's intentions of taking over Bulgaria. The Austrian foreign minister made it clear in November of 1886 that even a temporary single-handed occupation of Bulgaria by foreign troops, meaning of course Russia, without the previous consent of Turkey and the other powers would be a violation of the treaties, which in our opinion is not admissible. That's what he said. Meanwhile, in Berlin, the Russian ambassador told Bismarck that it is absolutely necessary that we should make Austria disappear from the map of Europe. Yikes. The League of the Three Emperors was visibly falling apart. War between Russia and Austria now seemed possible, and Austria and Britain both looked to Berlin to take the lead against Russia. But Bismarck was determined not to be pushed into a confrontation, especially at the very time that Bullinger was urging a war of revenge against Germany. He attempted to restrain both Austria and Russia when he described a two savage dogs. Bismarck again made very clear to his Austrian allies that Germany would not be dragged into a war against Russia. On the other hand, he was not prepared to stand back and see Austria defeated by Russia. To reconcile these two often conflicting objectives, he pursued his traditional policy of strengthening Austria while at the same time attempting to reassure Russia of Germany's peaceful intentions. Bismarck aimed to deter Russian expansion into the Balkans by encouraging Britain, Italy, and Austria-Hungary to negotiate the First Mediterranean Agreement in February 1887. This provided for the maintenance of the status quo in the Mediterranean, including the Adriatic and Aegean seas. He hoped that the agreement would encourage these three powers to stand up to Russia and convince Tsar Alexander III that only through negotiations with Berlin could a compromise over Bulgaria be arranged. Any improvement in Germany's relations with Russia was dependent on the struggle to influence the Tsar within his own government. Half his government was pan-Slavic and the other half was pro-German, which was their traditional foreign policy. In March 1887, Tsar Alexander III finally became impatient with his increasingly more powerful pan-Slavic government and decided to renegotiate with Germany. He wasn't ready to rejoin the Three Emperors Treaty of 1881, but he did agree to a secret negotiation which would last for 3 years with Germany. This was signed in June 1887. Its terms were that both emperors were pledged to be neutral in a war fought against a third power unless Germany attacked France or Russia or Austria. Germany recognized the rights historically acquired by Russia in the Balkans, particularly in Bulgaria and eastern Rumelia. Turkey was not open to the straits to the navy of a power hostile to Russia. This essentially meant the British. In his attempt to reconcile Austria and Russia, Bismarck had effectively created two contradictory diplomatic systems. On the one hand, the reinsurance treaty promised Russia German backing at the Straits and in Bulgaria, while the Mediterranean Agreement, the negotiation of which was encouraged by Bismarck, supported Austria by encouraging the territorial status quo. Bismarck did this because his ultimate fear was that if Austria and Russia went to war, Germany would face the threat of a war on two fronts. They still had a very angry and vengeful France on the other side. Luckily for them, the really warmongering war minister stepped down in May and there was a change of government in France. So while concentrating mainly on diffusing the Bulgarian crisis, Bismarck was also able to successfully isolate France in Western Europe. The Triple Alliance was renewed in February of 1887, and an Italian-Spanish agreement was signed aimed at preventing France from colonial expansion in North Africa. The reinsurance treaty did not immediately calm the tension in the Balkans. The election of Prince Ferdinand of Coburg to the Bulgarian throne in July of 1887 was regarded by the Russians as an Austrian conspiracy. Once again, the Pan-Slavs whipped up a press campaign against Germany, which was accused of secretly supporting Austria. In the autumn, the Russians carried out large-scale troop maneuvers on Germany's eastern borders, and so it seemed, began to prepare to advance into Bulgaria. To stop this, Bismarck very effectively used financial pressure. In November of 1887, the German government stopped the Reichsbank from accepting Russian bonds as collateral security for loans raised in Germany. This financial pressure had very serious economic consequences for the Russians, as Germany was the source of most of its foreign loans. Russia was plunged into a financial chaos which effectively prevented it from occupying Bulgaria or risking war with Austria. In December, Bismarck again, quite contrary to the spirit of the reinsurance treaty, further strengthened the position of Austria by persuading Britain and Italy to conclude with it a second Mediterranean agreement aimed at keeping Russia out of Bulgaria and Turkey. These measures successfully deterred Russians from invading Bulgaria, but they continued to do everything they could to undermine Ferdinand of Coburg. They also turned to France for the loans which the Germans were no longer ready to finance. Inevitably, this strengthened Franco-Russian relations, but neither side was yet ready to conclude an alliance. When Wilhelm II came to the German throne of June of 1888, he began to urge on Bismarck a British alliance. The Tsar rapidly became more appreciative of Bismarck's policy and offered to renew the reinsurance treaty permanently. Bismarck, however, was dismissed in March of 1890 before negotiations could begin, and his successor, convinced that it contradicted the Triple Alliance and would complicate Germany's relations with Britain, did not renew it. This effectively signaled the end of the Bismarckian alliance system. In 1907, a German economist, Sartorius von Waltherhausen, observed that contemporary Europe was a terrible contradiction. On the one hand, we see the members of various nations come together ever more frequently, how they try to understand each other, try to learn from each other, that the races of neighboring countries are becoming more and more mixed by migration and marriage. that no great work of science, technology, or art is born which does not rapidly become the common property of Europe. On the other hand, there was a darker side, the arms race, the struggle for the domination of Africa, Anglo-German commercial rivalry, and of course, the endless troubles in the Balkan Peninsula.